Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive.
Always. What are we exploring today?
Well, get ready to think about something you see literally everywhere you go, but probably never actually think about.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
Holes.
Holes. Really?
Yep, holes. Those empty spaces. Voids.
Huh. I never really thought about them as a topic for philosophical discussion.
Right. But that's what makes this so interesting. I mean, we use them every day. We count them like how many holes are in this piece of Swiss cheese or what. We even have all these different words for them.
Yeah, like pits, tunnels, hollows.
Exactly. So we clearly have an intuitive understanding of what a hole is, but if you try to actually define it,
It gets tricky.
it gets really tricky.
You said it. So where do we even begin with a hole?
I think the first thing is to acknowledge that a hole isn't really made of anything. It's the absence of something.
Right. It's not like a rock or a tree which have substance. It's more like, well, nothing.
So how can something be defined by what it lacks? That's the first philosophical hurdle.
Yeah, it challenges our typical way of thinking about objects and their properties. If a hole isn't made of stuff, what is it?
I mean, I know when there's a hole in my sock, but if it's not made of anything, what am I actually seeing?
That brings up the whole issue of perception. Like, how do we perceive something that's not there?
Exactly. And then there's the problem of identity. Like, what makes one hole different from another if it's not the material? Because, well, there isn't any.
And you can change the material around a hole, like a donut hole versus a bagel hole. They're both holes, but one's surrounded by dough and the other's surrounded by, well, more dough, just different dough.
Right. So what makes them distinct? Is it just their shape?
That's one theory, but then we get into even weirder territory when we start talking about parts and holes.
Parts and holes.
Yeah, in a philosophy, it's called mereology. Like, if you punch two holes in a piece of paper,
Oh, okay, I see where you're going with this.
is it one hole with two parts or two separate holes?
That's a good question. It kind of hurts my brain to think about it too hard. Is there even a right answer?
Well, that's part of the fun of philosophy. Sometimes the questions themselves are more illuminating than any definitive answer. And this leads to another debate. Are holes even necessary to explain the world?
What do you mean?
Well, some philosophers would say we can just describe everything in terms of the objects that the holes are in.
So instead of saying there's a hole in the cheese, we'd say something like, the cheese has a hole-shaped void.
Exactly.
But wouldn't that mean that every time the shape of that void changes, we have a new hole? That seems even more complicated.
Yeah, you can see how this debate can get pretty complex, and we've only just started.
I'm already feeling like I'm falling down a philosophical rabbit hole here, so I'm guessing philosophers have come up with some interesting ways to try and make sense of all this.
Oh yeah, they've definitely gotten creative. There are all sorts of theories about the nature of holes, ranging from seeing them as simple regions of space-time to considering them some kind of immaterial entity with its own unique properties.
Okay, now you're really making me curious. So let's
Let's dive into those theories, and some of them are really wild.
all right, lay it on me. What are some of the leading theories out there trying to explain these holes?
Well, one way to think about a hole is to say that it's just like a region of space-time.
A region of space-time.
Yeah, where there's no matter.
So just empty space.
Essentially, yeah. Empty space. But it gets a bit more complex when you start thinking about things like black holes.
Yes. Black holes, those are definitely holes, but they're also so much more than that, right?
Right. It's where physics and philosophy, really start to blend together.
Totally. All right, so empty space is one theory. What else? What are some other ways of thinking about holes?
Well, another theory is that a hole is actually the material surrounding it, the hole lining, you could say.
Wait, so like the hole in my donut is actually just donut?
In a way, yeah.
Okay, I think I'm following. So it's like the hole is defined by the stuff that's around it, not by the emptiness itself.
Right. Think about it this way. If you were to shrink down to a microscopic level,
Okay.
and you were to crawl along the inside of a donut hole, you'd constantly be touching donut.
Right.
Yeah, you'd never actually touch the hole itself.
Whoa, okay, that's a really interesting way to think about it.
Yeah, so in that sense, the hole is kind of like a property of the donut.
A property of the donut, okay. What other properties are there?
Okay, here's another one. There's the negative parts theory, which says that a hole is kind of like a missing piece of an object. Like, you know how in a jigsaw puzzle you might have a piece missing?
Oh, yeah.
The hole represents the absence of that piece. It's like a negative space in the puzzle.
I see. So all these theories are kind of trying to define a whole by relating it to something else.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They're all trying to find a way to explain how something that isn't there can still be, a thing.
Right. Because intuitively we all know what a whole is, but then when you try to put it into words...
It gets complicated, but then there's another set of theories that takes a different approach. They suggest that wholes might actually be immaterial entities.
Immaterial. Like ghosts.
Not quite ghosts, no, but more like abstract concepts. So think about numbers. We can't physically touch the number 3, right?
Right, it's an abstract concept.
But we all agree that it exists, it has properties, it can be added, subtracted, multiplied. So some philosophers argue that wholes might be similar to that. They might exist on a different plane of reality, so to speak.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see where you're going with this. So instead of trying to explain a whole in relation to the material world, these theories are saying that a whole could be its own thing, kind of like an idea.
Exactly. And they point to certain characteristics of wholes to support this view. Like one thing they often talk about is that wholes have this kind of parasitic existence. They can only exist in something else.
Right, like you never just see a hole floating around by itself. It's always a hole in something.
Precisely. And then there's this idea of fillability. You can fill a hole without destroying it.
Oh yeah, like filling a hole in the wall with spackle. The hole is still there, conceptually, even though it's been covered up.
Right. So the hole itself isn't made of matter, but it can be occupied by matter, which leads to another interesting point. Holes can share their location with whatever's filling them.
Wait, what? So a hole and the thing that fills it are in the same place at the same time?
Exactly. It's kind of mind-bending, right?
It is. It feels like we're getting into some pretty, like, deep metaphysical territory here.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Holes really make you question some fundamental assumptions about how we think about objects in space.
For sure. So what else do these holes as immaterial entities folks say?
Well, they also point out that holes can have parts and can be part of bigger holes.
What do you mean?
Think of like a sponge. It's full of little holes, but all those little holes make up the larger structure of the sponge, which is also kind of a hole itself.
Ah, I see what you mean. It's like holes all the way down.
Right. And this, mirological structure is another argument for seeing holes as entities with their own unique properties. And finally, there's just the sheer variety of holes out there. We have hollows, cavities, tunnels, perforations. They all have different shapes, different functions.
Right, like a hole in a donut is very different from a hole in the ground.
Exactly. So the idea is that if holes were just the absence of matter, then there wouldn't be so much variety. There wouldn't be all these different types of holes.
That's a really interesting point. I never thought about it that way before. So, I mean, all of this talk about holes as immaterial entities is pretty mind-blowing. Does it actually change how we understand the world?
Well, that's a great question. It definitely challenges our usual way of thinking about what it means for something to exist. I mean, if something can exist without being made of matter, what does that tell us about the nature of reality itself?
It's like holes are poking holes in our traditional ways of thinking. Haha.
I love that. I think it really highlights how important it is to, stay open to different perspectives and to question our assumptions.
This whole discussion has really been eye-opening. I'm looking at everything differently now. Every pothole, every coffee cup,
Every donut.
every donut is suddenly a philosophical enigma. So I have to ask, after all this, where do you stand on this whole debate? Do you think they exist as entities in their own right?
Honestly, I find myself really drawn to the idea that holes are more than just nothing. Their unique properties, and all these philosophical puzzles they pose, it really suggests that there's something more to them than meets the eye. But ultimately, I think the most important takeaway is the process of questioning and exploring these ideas.
I totally agree. So on that note, I think it's time to turn the question over to you, dear listeners. Yeah, it's really kind of shifted my perspective, too. Makes you realize how much we take for granted.
Absolutely. Like, we tend to think of the world as being made of stuff, right? Matter, energy. But holes, they kind of flip that on its head.
Yeah, they make you think about the absence of things and whether that absence itself could be a defining characteristic.
Right. Like, can nothing be something? It's a question that goes way back, really gets at the heart of metaphysics.
Metaphysics.
The study of what exists, what is reality, big questions.
No kidding. I have to say, my brain is definitely feeling a little bit full of holes after this deep dive.
I know what you mean, but it's a good kind of full, I think.
Definitely. Makes you look at everything a little differently. Suddenly, even the holes in my Swiss cheese are way more interesting.
I think that's one of the best things about these deep dives. It's all about seeing the world with new eyes, questioning our assumptions about things, even the things we encounter every day.
Absolutely. And you know what? We haven't even covered all the theories about holes out there.
Oh, not even close. Like, we didn't even touch on the idea of holes as disturbances, kind of like a knot in a rope or a ripple in a pond, or the theory that holes are just properties of objects or relations between things.
Wow, so many ways to think about wholes.
Right. It really shows that there's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider, no matter how much you think you know about something.
I love that. And speaking of learning more, it looks like we've reached the end of our whole for today.
Time to fill it in.
But hopefully we've sparked some interesting thoughts, some new ways of looking at the world.
Yeah, the next time you see a hole, don't just dismiss it as empty space. Take a moment to really think about it. What is it, really?
Maybe you'll even come up with your own theory about holes, who knows. But to get those wheels turning, I'm going to leave you with one final holy question. If a whole is defined by what it lacks, matter, does that mean it's defined by something that doesn't exist? How can something be defined by what's not there? Something to ponder, folks. Until next time, happy hole hunting.